Hello and welcome to EE 333. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In the last video, we were working with our user panel.java, and we were able to get the import and export functions working, except we had a little bit of an awkward time calling them. And what I mean by that is we essentially went into our constructor, and after calling the init components, and doing the setup of our pop-up menus or combo boxes. Basically there at the end, we simply appended a couple of steps that would set a file to read from, import that file, and then export the user. The end result was that we would take our sample.user, we would import it, thereby creating an object that was then stored as part of the panel by virtue of the fact that it was a private variable user. And then from there, we made a call to our export custom, and our export custom basically leveraged that user, the this.user, and at that point then would export the current state of the object after collecting the information from the graphical user interface. Now, we said that this was rather awkward because basically all it was meant to be a test. In this video, what we want to do is we want to get away from hard coding this inside of our constructor, but rather we want to tie it to a set of buttons in our user interface. So the first step I'm going to do is I'm actually going to Control X or delete the code. I'm going to pop open Notepad and I'm going to paste the code into a separate file. Now, from there, what we want to do is we want to come over now to our user frame. Now, just a quick reminder, our user frame essentially contains a user panel as well as a second panel with some additional controls on it. The idea is that instead of doing the hard-coded import and export that we did, instead what we would do is we would use these import and export buttons to call the methods associated with the panel. So the idea here is that I click on the import button, for instance, it would make a call to the panel's import with the file name, and it would then populate these fields with the contents of that file, assuming, of course, that the file was found and that it was successfully imported. So without further ado, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and get the button click essentially for both our import and our export setup. So that's where we're going to spend the majority of our time today. So with the import, we're going to come back to picking a file using a file explorer or a file browser. We'll work on that in a separate video. What we're going to do with the import is we're going to assume that the file name is in the accompanying text box. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a couple of temporary variables here. One is going to be a string, and I'm just going to simply call that input file name. The second one is actually going to be a java.io.file because we're going to use that as part of our import. If you recall, we had an overload for an import that accepted a file as well as an import that accepted a string. And if you want a quick reminder of the overloads here, you remember we actually spent a fair amount of time creating these. You have your import custom and your import custom that accepts a file as well as one that accepts a string. So we're going to show that we can at least leverage the file, and from there you can practice then with the file name one as well. But in this case, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and have a temporary variable for our input file. Now our input file name is just going to be equal to this dot And then you want to look for your J text that is associated with your input. And you want to get the text. In other words, whatever is in that text box, we're going to collect. Now, we're going to assume that the get text does not return a null object, but instead returns an empty string. At this point, then, what we want to do is we want to set up some basic triaging or some basic logic. And so to begin with, what we want to do is we want to see if that string is of length 0 or if it's greater than 0. So what we can do here is some simple logic, something along these lines right here. If our input file name and the length associated with that is equal to 0, in other words, not a possible file name, you could argue that technically speaking, in order to have a file and an extension, you would have to have a minimum of one letter for the file name, a period, and then one letter for the extension. So the shortest valid file name with an extension would actually be 3 characters. You could also argue that if we were going to import our custom file, then the longest possible file would actually be 6 characters long, 4 for the .user extension, 1 for the period, and then a minimum of 1 character for the ID or for the file name. So you could improve on this. The other thing that we could do is we could also, after checking to see if it was equal to 0, we could also follow this up with an else if input file name. And what we would do then is we could split the file by the period and then look at the extension to see if it matches a valid set of file extensions. In which case, the other option would be to simply use our contains method of our string, in which case to check to see that it either contained the .user file extension. So if this was equal to false, and the input file name .contains, and we also want to be able to support our .xml file extension. If both of those equal to false, that means that we did not have a valid file extension, or at least not one that we were prepared yet to support. I think I'm missing a parentheses there. There we go. So not a valid file extension. And from there, then, what we want to do is any additional error checking, but assuming that we managed to make it to the else at this point, we could then use a nested if statement to handle the different file extensions. And so one way to do this would then be to simply say if our input file name .contains, once again, we'll check for the .user file extension, which may appear redundant, but in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if it's true, and then follow up with else if input file name .contains a .xml file extension. If that were equal to true, then under our else if, and then lastly, let's see here, else. Ideally, we should not reach here. I think I've now got my parentheses mismatched. Nope, looks right. So we should not reach here currently. We may change our logic just a little bit. But in either scenario here, what we want to do now is we want to assume that at least we have a working file extension. in which case what we want to do is we want to go ahead and create our input file. So our input file is going to be equal to new java.io.file. And at this point, then we're going to assume that that input file name is in fact valid. Just notice that we have a issue here. Let's see if we can't resolve this one. So this dot jtext. All right, let's see if we can figure out where my NetBeans has decided to give up on me. I think I've got a few too many curly braces here for its liking. And let's see now, let's try that one more time, is equal to this dot jtext input dot get text. All right, kind of unusual how it decided to go back and complain about code that was already correct, even though the error was down further. That just gives you an example of where the Java parser in NetBeans just kind of gives up at some point, says, I have no idea what you're trying to do. But here what we've done is we've then went ahead and created a java.io.file from the input file name. And what you can do now, once you have that, is you can make a slight modification to our if statement. As a matter of fact, what we're going to do is we're going to bump our checking for the extension. We're going to bump that down just a little bit. And what we're going to do is the first question we're going to ask is, does our input file exist? And so now that we have created the io.file, we need to find out if it exists. And if it's false, once again, we can provide some sort of message back to the user. We haven't really been providing any messages yet. We'll get to that in just a second. But at this point, we do not have a valid file. All right, so first off, we start with the file name. Then we check for the extension, if it's even a valid file extension for us. If it's a valid file extension, then we check to see if the file actually exists. And there are other ways to do this logic. But what I want to focus on now is when we get to these else ifs, if this is the scenario, then what we can do is we can actually use our JPanel and our poorly named JPanel. So why don't we take just a second to fix that. I'm going to come over here to my design view. I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to the change variable names. I'm just going to drop the 1 off of it because it does happen to be our only user panel. And we're going to do now, save it. Let's go back to our source and our JPanel. Let's see here. It doesn't appear to have registered that. One more time. Let's go back here to our design view. Let's make sure that that took. Yes. Let's go ahead and build it. Well, it seems to think it's valid. Let's see what's going on here. So this .jpanel dot. Let's see here under the right, and then not sure why. So, all right, so let's see here. Feeling that this is going to error on us, but we're going to stick with it. What we're going to do now is we want to call our, so something is not happy here. All right, 1 second. I see what the problem is here. I have a couple of poorly named panels here, not just one. So why don't we go ahead and create some better names here. So this is actually our JPanel. How about we call this one our controller? because this is actually what's going to drive, or actually, I tell you what, that's even a better name for it, JPanel driver. And then this is our JUser panel. And let's go ahead and go back here now to our code one more time. We should be able to find it. Had the wrong panel name, so this is going to be the J, then our user panel, this dot. All right, so I'm still not seeing it. Let's see if we can figure out where the problem is here. So this right here. Ah, okay, so I was a little lackadaisical here. We can keep consistent here. Why don't we go ahead and call that a JUser panel? There we go. Now this should work. Always got to pay attention to the details here. There we go. So there's our JUser panel, and assuming that a file extension is .user, then what we want to do is we want to import our custom, but we want to use the import custom with the overload for a file name. In this case, we're going to specify our input file. And just to complete this, we're going to go ahead and fill this one in as well, even though we don't have the code working yet for our import XML. But we want to also be able to pass an input file to our import XML. And now what we would want to do is we would want to at least provide some feedback to the user, whether it's through the console or through a message box. Now, we'll get a chance to work with message boxes in just a second. Right now, we're going to just rely solely on our output here. So our system.out.println, and provide some friendly messages here. So error, zero length, file name, or something equivalent. I suppose you could argue that the word error is never friendly. We can also say unhandled exception, or extension rather. And likewise, we can put that here. About the only one that we haven't handled yet is when the file name does not exist. So error, then file name does not exist. And something that might be useful is, instead of specifying just file name, is that you come along and you actually specify what the user entered. And so something along these lines then. Okay, so error, whatever that file is, does not exist. All right, now what we want to do is we want to come over here now to our user frame, not the user panel. Remember, the user frame is the one that is standalone. We want to right click on it, and we want to go ahead and run the file. And we should, just like in the earlier video, now see our drop-down menus being populated with the state and the enums. Now, ideally, what we would want to have happen is we would want to be able to type in a given input file. And so in this case, what we're wanting to do is type in our sample.user. And I'm going to select now import. And you'll see that essentially what it's doing is, behind the scenes, it's doing what we had hard-coded earlier. And what I mean by that is this line right here, where it's importing our sample user. It's utilizing the import custom from our panel control, our panel method. Our panel method then passes the file name on to the import. Actually, rather than passing the file, it's actually passing the contents of the file. So if you go back here to our user panel, and our user our import custom, what it does is it actually reads the file and then turns around and then passes the file name through the import string function. Okay, so it passes there the file name. Once it has the file name, then it reads the contents of the file. And then at that point, then it returns as a string the contents of the file, at which point then it passes it on to the import custom overload, which accepts a string. At that point, the import custom that accepts a string calls the factory method in your user class. And once again, hopefully you can see that this is like the layers of an onion. Okay, the behavior, in this case, the creation of a new user, is not driven directly by the panel or by the frame, but rather by the factory method associated with the class. All right, so far so good. Let's see now about our JButton export. Okay, and what we want to do here, this one's going to be a little bit trickier because we can't just blindly assume then that we have a valid user. What we want to do now is we want to leverage the export custom, but we would like to provide a file to it. And if you recall, inside the export custom, it actually checked to see that the user was not null. It checked to see if the status was incomplete and so on. And likewise, now in the export custom, we want to be able to do the same thing. Now, before we go any further, we need to go back over to our user panel.java, and we need to take a close look at how we have handled our export custom. We spent a lot of time in an earlier video sort of trying to triage whether or not the user already existed before we attempted to export them. The problem with it is that we might have written our functions in such a way that we've backed ourselves into a corner. And let me explain real quick. So essentially, our public Boolean export custom does not accept any input arguments, in which case it essentially auto-identifies the ID or the user ID as being the file name. So we convert the ID into id.user to make it the file name. And we do that after we have checked the status is not incomplete, that the ID and the text are not empty, and so on. It's only then that we actually start to collect the information off the form, essentially synchronize the form to the underlying user, and then we attempt to export it. We export it calling the overload that accepts a file. Now, nothing wrong with that, but the problem with it is that the export custom that accepts the file essentially relies on the checking from the earlier function or from its compatriot function, the overload without any arguments. Now, the problem that we run into is that we could potentially do all of that validation again, in which case then we would essentially have code in duplicate spots. The flip side of that is, of course, that we then have to make sure and synchronize that code. In other words, that we need to make sure and in both locations have the exact same error checking. Another possibility is that we simply turn this export custom, this overload, into a private, which means that it's inaccessible from anywhere outside of the panel. And that kind of restricts functionality, meaning that the only way we could export a user would be to use the ID of the user to create the file name. So there has to be another way. And so what we're going to do is we're going to explore that by borrowing some of this code up here, meaning that instead of doing complete validation in our first export custom, we're going to do minimal validation. In other words, just enough to be able to appropriately get the file name set up. All right, so what I mean by that is if you take a look in our try catch, we first establish the enum, the value of the enum. So we do need to do that because we're going to use that later. And we're going to check to see if the user is null. If the user is null, then we clearly have a no user to export. We want to go ahead and check the status of that user. And as we mentioned before, we probably could consider also checking to see what the status is on the GUI. Now that you could argue could potentially be pushed off to the second function. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a copy of all of the code that follows this first conversion of the string to an enum. And I'm just going to paste it once again into Notepad so that we've got it to look back on. And instead, what I want to do is I want to focus in on this portion right here and everything that comes after this. So in other words, if the underlying object is incomplete, we don't want to do anything. And also, if the underlying object's ID is equal to empty string, or the text is equal to an empty string, we don't want to do anything. So if anything, what we could do is we could come along and we could simply combine one of our steps here. So I'm going to go ahead, since I've made a copy of this, I can unceremoniously delete this, and I'm actually going to unceremoniously delete everything after it. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to combine some of this. So if either the status of the user, the underlying object, is incomplete, or the pop-up menu is incomplete, so if either of those scenarios are true, then we want to do nothing. And then likewise, if the ID, the underlying object ID, is empty, or the text in the panel is empty, we want to do nothing. But if all of those conditions have been avoided, in other words, if we've managed to make it all the way to the else, what we want to do is we want to create then a new file based on the ID from the user, which means the only thing that we technically need to do is we need to make sure that the user ID of the underlying object is not equal to an empty string. Well, that presents an interesting problem then, because if we look at the way we have this worded, if the underlying empty string is equal to an empty, excuse me, if the underlying ID is equal to an empty string, or the ID, the text box, is equal to an empty string, we are going to get kicked out of this if statement. So notice right now it's an or. If we set it equal to anything else, basically we require then that both of these are populated. In other words, we have the scenario in which we have an empty ID in the underlying object and we're attempting to add one through the GUI. We're still going to end up getting kicked out of the if statement. So we've got to figure out a better way to check this so that we can use then the underlying string or the underlying ID to populate our file name. So this brings us then to an interesting question. Do we trust the underlying object, or do we trust the GUI? In other words, which one of the two do we want to drive the export? And so what you could argue is that the GUI is attempting to update the underlying user. So in other words, the values that are in the GUI should take precedence over the ones that are in the underlying object. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to essentially ignore the values that are in the underlying object in this version of our export custom. So I'm going to start off, I'm actually going to ignore both the underlying object's status as well as the ID. So in other words, if the user somehow, if the person who was using your GUI changed the status of the user to incomplete, then that should result in us failing to export the user. Likewise, if for some reason they deleted the text somehow, then they should not be able to export the user. Which brings us now to how do we construct this output file? So rather than rely on this .user.getID, instead what we should do is rely on this .jtextID.getText. Now, there was nothing wrong with the earlier version. It clearly worked. However, our needs have changed. We want to now be able to use these export functions in different ways than what we did earlier. So what we're doing is now we're sort of adapting our logic here and improving our logic. And so now hopefully you can see that essentially this export custom does just enough error checking to be able to successfully create the file. And then from there, it passes it on to the second version of the export custom. The second version of the export custom needs to be able to do more. Okay, so it needs to be able to do more. And also, you could argue, for instance, that this particular portion of code where we're actually setting the status of the user doesn't even necessarily need to be done in this first function. So actually, we're going to go ahead and get rid of this as well. All right, so we're actually, let me rephrase that. We're not going to get rid of it. We're actually going to move it. So this is essentially much more stripped down logic. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to apply this logic now to our second overload. And so the first thing our second overload is going to try to do is it's going to go ahead and set the status for the underlying object. It's going to go ahead and do the preliminary checking or the validation of both the underlying object, whether the object is null, and so on. So in other words, we want to check the status, we want to check the ID, we want to check the text. Technically, we should not have gotten here, at least if we had called it from our own export custom, but since it's public, we could technically call it from outside our panel. And once the ID has been validated, both on the underlying object and in the text field, we continue on, and finally we are bringing the values into the underlying object, which brings us back now to this question right here: which one do we trust? So once again, do we need this to check that this .user.getID is equal to an empty quotes? Well, not if you assume that the graphical user interface essentially can update the user, okay? And so that gets back to whether or not we allow for a user field to be modified. the user ID field rather, to be modified. So just to emphasize this, I'm going to make one minor modification now to this particular statement right here. I'm still going to keep the check to see if it's equal to an empty quote, because we do want to make sure that we can't somehow pass a ID, empty ID, to a file. In other words, that our user has to have an ID. But what I'd like to do now is I'd like to make a kind of a little bit of an odd change here. So we want to check to see that the get ID is not equal to 0, or that our this dot user dot get ID dot see here, I've got once this dot user dot get ID dot, there we go, equals ignore case. And now we want to compare this to our this dot jtext ID dot get text. And let's back out the parentheses here. All right, and a quick reminder with our equals ignore case, you can always open up the Java doc, or you can simply just right click and navigate to. You'll notice that it is a Boolean. And so in this case, what we want to do is we want to compare these two. And if these two equals ignore case, if this returns false, that means what the GUI has and what the underlying object has is different. Okay, so essentially what we've got is if the ID, underlying ID, is empty string, or if there's some discrepancy between the ID of the underlying object and the text, in both scenarios, we don't want to do anything more. Now, if neither of those scenarios are true and none of the other scenarios are true, then we get to the point where we can go back to now taking the strings that are in the user interface and assigning them to the underlying object, at which point we can then remove this code, because this is actually the code that we were calling earlier to call this function, so we don't need that anymore. Instead, what we can do now is we can actually write to the file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this code up in here to the else branch, and now effectively this function, this overload, is the function that does all of the work. Not only does it validate the graphical user interface data, but it also then synchronizes the GUI with the underlying object and also attempts to write to the file. So about the only thing then we've got left to do here is under this try catch, we probably should go ahead and say results equal to false if we throw an exception. We'll see if we've missed anything else there. Probably that's not a fatal error. So in other words, we don't need to check the results equal to false if for whatever reason the enum doesn't survive. But effectively, I think we've got all of it here. And so at this point, what we can do, we'll go ahead and save it. We'll go back to our J button export, in which case we can simply say this dot J user panel dot export custom, and essentially this will now call the export function that attempts to grab the ID, turn it into a file. It will then call the overload of export custom that then further validates all of the information and then actually write the contents of the file. So I'm going to go and close out my GUI here. I'm going to go ahead and build it once more. Let's see here, we're going to go ahead and save it. Let's see if we need to build it. No, we've already up to date. So now what we want to do is right click, run. And once again, we should have our pre-populated GUI. We want to import. By the way, if we hit import right now, you should see an error that says zero length file name. Looks like it's working for us. We also might as well go ahead and take a second to check. So something, or how about if we actually say sample.bob. Sample.bob, if we hit import, should say unhandled extension. So that's looking promising. And now we want to have our sample.user like we did earlier. All right, we've got that's populating. Notice I have a grayed out field. So technically I can't goof up the ID, which is exactly why we want to use a graphical user interface. But now what we want to do is we want to export. Now in this case, I'm not providing it with a file name. I'm just hitting export. And the question is, did anything happen? Well, let's come back over here. I'm going to go ahead and delete this file. If you're eagle-eyed, you notice that I have already changed the timestamp, but we're going to pretend that I didn't see that, in which case I'm just going to hit export. And now if you go here, you should see a new gmyers.user. And sure enough, I've managed to export my file using the default file name or the ID. Well, that kind of ignores the reason for using this text field. So let's close this out. Let's make one more change to our user frame. Let's, if anything, let's make this a little more sophisticated. We can throw a little bit of logic in here. And that is what we can do is we can say if this dot jtext output dot get all right, so if this dot let's see here. I'm not sure how I've managed to break NetBeans again, but I have. So let's try this one more time. If this dot, all right. So let's see what we've got here. There we go. If this dot jtext output, all right, let's go back and see what has happened here to our graphical user interface here. All right, so what did we call this? Okay, jtext output. All right, so if this dot jtext output dot get text. All right, I'm not sure why it's not letting me do this. All right, for some reason it seems to be having an issue with this line in here temporarily. We'll come back to that. So if this .jtext output get text, if the length of this is equal to 0, essentially what we want to do is do nothing. And what does do nothing look like? Well, we can come up here, we can actually get lazy and borrow some of our help here or some of our output. We simply can print out 0 length file name. We'll have something similar here. We'll say else if this .jtext output dot. Okay, let's see if we can figure out here where this is having an issue. Mismatched parentheses. All right, so this .jtext output .get text .length. Actually, in this case, what we want to do is we want to compare. We want to see, does it contain either a .user file extension? So in other words, if this is false, actually what we could do in this particular case, we can actually tweak our logic. We don't have to use the exact same logic that we had up here, because what we're really hoping to do is just make sure that we have a valid file name. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a little bit of a tweak here. So I'm going to change my approach. As I was thinking this through, I realized that we could do this a little more efficiently here. So how about if we say, if this .jtext output .get text, let's go ahead and get rid of all this. So get text and if that length right there, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to leverage length, but I'm going to say if it is greater than 5, and you're going to see in just a second where I got this from. So if it's greater than 5 and this .jtext output .get text contains, in this case, .user. So there's where I got my 5 from. So if this is true, then what this means that I want to do is I want to make a call to this .j user panel .export custom output file. And what we're going to do now is we're actually going to have a java.io .file, and we're going to call it output file. And the only way we initialize this is if we actually have a text in our JText output that meets our criteria. So in this case, output file is going to be equal to new java.io.file. And what I'm going to use is I'm going to use my this.jtext output .get text, and I'm going to simply concatenate onto the end of it the .user. And I'm not, once again, real sure where it's having issues here. So this clearly, to me, is a flaw in NetBeans at this point. I'm not sure if this is my cache. There we go. I see what the problem is. It was my habit of using parentheses right there. There we go. All right, so it's no flaw in NetBeans. It was just my habit of using parentheses. All right, so basically at this point, we're creating a new output file and we're passing it. Likewise, if we have an else if, the only difference here with the second condition, in addition to changing it to XML, is that technically the shortest that the file name can be is 5. So in other words, if it's greater than 5, at this point, we can go ahead and create the new file name. And actually, as it turns out, I'm going to drop this. We don't have to append the .user because actually it's contained in the jtext.output. And then from that point, then the only thing we've got to do is this .jpanel driver, JUser panel rather, .export XML. Okay. Now we've got a little bit of tidying up to do in that function. I'll do that real quick off screen, but under the else, then we want to do nothing. All right, so hopefully you can see now how we're essentially building this driver up to be able to essentially control the panel that we have spent so much time working on. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to come back over to my user panel. I'm going to make the changes that I need to on my export XML. I'll do that briefly in another video. But then from there, what we will do is we will come back and we will make sure then that our import and export XML both work as well. What I want to do right now is I want to make sure that our user frame works for the import and export custom. And so we should have everything wired up correctly. Let's go ahead and run this. Once again, we're going to type in sample.user. I'm going to go ahead and hit import. There's my information. I'm going to come along over here now. I'm going to go ahead and delete my gmyers.user. If our logic is correct in our export, nothing should happen when I hit export. Why? Well, because I didn't provide a file name. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to specify bob.user, which should meet our requirements. And sure enough, there we go. We have now created a bob.user file that technically has my user information in there. Now, one last little tweak that we'd like to be able to make is we didn't provide a file name. We'd like to have that overload such that when we hit export, it still utilized that first function, meaning that if the output JText output dot length was equal to 0, that you would still get an output. Well, what we would do here is we'd come over to our JFrame, and we could simply have just one more option here. So the default option, in which case it's going to be if this dot JText output dot length is equal to 0. And then what you would do is you would make the rest of these the else if. And in this scenario right here, what you would do is you could optionally choose to call this dot JUserPanel dot export custom with no input arguments. All right. And once again, what have I done here? Dot this dot J output dot get text and length. There we go. All right. Okay, once again, this is optional. It's up to you. What do you want the default behavior to be? All right, let's go ahead and close this real quick. We'll go ahead and run it one more time. And now what I can do is I can come along and say sample.user. I can import. And just to be clear, we're going to change this to some other way just to make sure that you don't think that I am doing any magic behind the scenes. What I'm going to do is we're going to go ahead and delete our bob.user. I'm going to go ahead and hit export. And sure enough, there's our gmyers.user. Gmyers.user now lives it some other way. And then if you come back here once more, I'm going to put in bob.user export. And sure enough, there's our bob.user. So hopefully you found this video useful. Like I said, in a separate video, I'm going to go ahead and show how to do the XML import and export. Additionally, I'm also going to show you how to do this from the command line. So as always, if you've got any questions or comments, don't hesitate to email me.